The millionaire disinherited his son for wanting to marry a humble farmer. When he visited him to see how hard his son's life was, he was paralyzed by what he saw. Jack Whitman had always been a man of high expectations, especially when it came to his only son, Aiden. As the head of Whitman Enterprises, a conglomerate known for its wealth and influence, Jack had envisioned a clear path for Aiden, one that would ensure the family legacy was carried forward. From a young age, Aiden had been groomed to take over the business, attending the best schools, mingling with the right people and learning the ins and outs of the corporate world. Jack was convinced that Aiden would step into his shoes and continue expanding the empire he had built from scratch. But there was a growing rift between father and son. Aiden was restless, his heart not entirely set on the corporate lifestyle that Jack had mapped out for him. He often felt suffocated by the expectations and obligations that came with being a Whitman. While Jack was proud and driven, Aiden was introspective, searching for something more meaningful, something that went beyond boardrooms and business deals. Jack, however, dismissed Aiden's concerns as youthful indecision, certain that he would eventually fall in line. Everything changed during a weekend getaway to a small picturesque village called Cedar Creek. Jack had sent Aiden on a retreat to clear his mind before taking on a new project for the company. Cedar Creek was a quaint little town surrounded by lush greenery, rolling hills, and a sense of serenity that contrasted sharply with the bustling city life Aiden was used to. It was here, in this quiet corner of the world, that Aiden met Madison. Madison was a simple, warm-hearted woman who lived and worked on her family's farm. Unlike the people Aiden was accustomed to, she had no interest in material wealth or social status. She was genuine, grounded, and full of life. Aiden was immediately drawn to her easy laugh, her bright eyes, and the way she spoke about the land with such love and care. Madison had a way of making everything seem less complicated, and Aiden found solace in her company. They spent long afternoons together talking, laughing, and discovering just how different their worlds were. Yet despite the differences, there was a connection between them that Aiden couldn't ignore. As the weekend passed, Aiden felt a growing sense of clarity. Being with Madison made him realize how much he craved simplicity, honesty, and a life where he could be true to himself. He saw in her a freedom he had never known, and it stirred something deep inside him. For once, Aiden felt he had found a place where he belonged, even if it meant stepping away from everything he had been taught to value. When Aiden returned to the city, he was a changed man. He no longer wanted to follow the path his father had set for him. Instead, he wanted to explore this newfound sense of purpose he had discovered with Madison. But Jack was not the type of man to let things deviate from his plans. When Aiden shared his feelings, Jack was incredulous. "You met a girl in Cedar Creek, and now you're ready to throw everything away." Jack's voice was cold, his words laced with disbelief. "You're going to turn your back on everything I've built for you for some farmer?" "It's not like that, Dad," Aiden said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Madison is. She's different. She makes me happy. I've never felt this way before." "You're blinded, Aiden. This isn't love. It's a distraction," Jack snapped. "You don't understand what's at stake. You have responsibilities to the family, to the business. You can't just walk away." But Aiden stood his ground for the first time in his life. He felt sure of what he wanted. And it wasn't the life of luxury and power that Jack had laid out for him. It was a life where he could be himself, even if that meant living on a modest farm in Cedar Creek with Madison. Jack, unable to comprehend Aiden's decision, grew more agitated in his eyes. Aiden was making the biggest mistake of his life, determined to bring his son back to his senses. Jack issued an ultimatum. "You have a choice to make, Aiden," he said, his tone icy. "Either you forget about this nonsense and focus on your future here, or you walk away from all of this, your inheritance, your position, everything. If you choose her, you're on your own." The words hung in the air, heavy and final. Aiden felt his heart pound in his chest. He knew what his father's wealth and connections meant. Walking away would mean losing everything he had known. And yet the thought of a life without Madison was something he couldn't bear. After a long, agonizing silence, Aiden finally spoke. "Then I choose her," he said, his voice firm. "I choose Madison." Jack's eyes darkened with fury. "So be it," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're no longer my son. Consider yourself disowned." As Aiden walked out of the grand, opulent Whitman mansion that evening, he felt a strange mix of fear and liberation. He was stepping into an uncertain future, leaving behind the comfort and security of his past. But for the first time he was following his heart. The bright city lights faded behind him as he drove back to Cedar Creek, the place where he felt he truly belonged. Meanwhile, Jack watched from his office window, his jaw clenched in anger. He believed that it was only a matter of time before Aiden would realize the gravity of his mistake and come crawling back. After all, what did a simple farm girl have to offer that could possibly compare to the power and prestige of the Whitman name? Jack was sure that his son's infatuation with Madison would fade, and he would soon return, ready to take his place in the family empire. But Jack had no idea just how much his son was willing to fight for the life he wanted, or how this decision would set off a chain of events that would change everything. The weeks that followed Aiden's decision were a whirlwind of change. He had always known his life was going to shift once he chose Madison, but nothing could have fully prepared him for the reality of starting over. Without the financial cushion he had always relied on, everything felt different. The safety net was gone, and now he had to face the world on his own terms. Aiden packed his essentials, leaving behind the sleek suits, polished shoes and luxury accessories that defined his life in the city. Instead, he filled his bags with practical clothes, things he would need to adapt to a life on the farm. He knew Madison's world would be vastly different from anything he'd ever known, and he was ready to embrace it, even if it meant giving up his comfort. His decision to leave Whitman Enterprises had spread like wildfire. Friends, colleagues, and even distant acquaintances were shocked. To many, it seemed unthinkable that someone would walk away from such a privileged position. But for Aiden it was simple. He was choosing love over luxury, happiness over expectation. Jack's ultimatum had been harsh, but it had also been clarifying. For once, Aiden had a clear direction, even if it was one that Jack couldn't understand. Jack, on the other hand, was still fuming. He saw Aiden's departure as a betrayal, not just of the family business, but of everything he had ever done for his son. Over the years, he had worked tirelessly to build Whitman Enterprises into a powerhouse, and he had done it all with Aiden in mind: the company, the empire, the wealth. It was supposed to be Aiden's legacy. To see him throw it all away for a life on a farm was an insult Jack could hardly bear. One evening, Jack decided to confront Aiden one last time. He had been waiting for Aiden to come to his senses, but as the days passed, it became clear that wasn't going to happen. He drove to Cedar Creek, a rare journey for a man who usually preferred the confines of the city. Determined to make Aiden understand the gravity of his actions when he arrived, he found Aiden and Madison sitting on the porch, sharing a quiet moment as the sun dipped below the horizon. "Aiden," Jack said, stepping out of his car, his voice sharp and commanding, "we need to talk." Aiden looked up, surprised to see his father there. He hadn't expected Jack to come all the way to Cedar Creek, but he knew this conversation was inevitable. He excused himself from Madison and walked over to where his father stood, a stern look on Jack's face. "What are you doing here, Dad?" Aiden asked, trying to keep his tone neutral. "I came to talk some sense into you," Jack replied, his expression hard. "This has gone on long enough. You're throwing your life away. And for what? A fantasy." "It's not a fantasy, Dad," Aiden said, his patience wearing thin. "This is my life. It's real. And it's what I want." "What do you want?" Jack scoffed. "Do you have any idea how many people would kill for the opportunities you're walking away from? The life you're choosing is beneath you. Aiden, it's a waste." Aiden felt a pang of frustration. He had tried to explain this before, but Jack simply couldn't see past his own values. "It's not a waste if it makes me happy," Aiden said firmly. "I know it's hard for you to understand, but this isn't about the money or the business. I want to be with Madison. I want to live a life that feels right for me. And you think this farm girl is worth giving up? Everything." Jack shot back, his voice rising. "You're being foolish, Aiden. You're acting on impulse. This isn't love. It's infatuation. And it will pass. When it does, you'll be left with nothing. Then I guess I'll have to find out for myself." Aiden replied, his voice steady. "But I'd rather risk everything for something real than stay trapped in a life that doesn't mean anything to me." Jack's hands clenched into fists at his sides. He had never been this angry, nor had he ever felt so powerless. He was used to being in control. And yet here was his son, standing in front of him, defying everything he had tried to instill in him. For a moment there was a silence, heavy and thick with tension. "Fine," Jack said at last, his voice cold and final. "If this is what you want, then so be it. But don't come crawling back when it all falls apart. From this moment on, you're cut off. No money, no support, nothing. You're on your own." Aiden felt his heart sank, but he didn't let his resolve waver. He knew Jack was trying to scare him, to make him feel the weight of his decision, but he had already made up his mind. "I understand," he said quietly. "I'm not asking for anything, Dad. Just let me live my life." Jack stared at Aiden as if searching for a hint of doubt, but found none. With a bitter shake of his head, he turned and walked back to his car. "You'll regret this," he said over his shoulder, his voice almost a whisper. "Mark my words." As Jack drove away, Aiden watched the tail lights fade into the distance, a sense of finality washing over him. This was it. There was no turning back. Now, he had chosen Madison, and in doing so he had chosen a life completely different from the one his father had planned for him. It was terrifying but also liberating. For the first time he felt like he was in control of his own destiny, even if it meant facing uncertainty. When he returned to the porch, Madison was waiting for him. Concern etched across her face. "Is everything okay?" she asked softly. Aiden nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "Yeah, everything's fine," he said. I made my choice." Madison reached out and took his hand, her grip warm and reassuring. "I'm glad," she said. "I know it wasn't easy, but I'm proud of you." Aiden felt a swell of emotion as he looked at Madison, realizing just how much she meant to him. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "for being here, for everything. We're in this together." Madison replied, her eyes shining with determination. "No matter what." And with that, the two of them stood on the porch side by side, watching the stars begin to twinkle in the night sky. It wasn't the life Aiden had been raised for, but it was the life he had chosen. And as long as Madison was by his side, he knew he would find a way to make it work. Leaving behind the city and the comforts of his previous life, Aiden drove back to Cedar Creek with a mix of excitement and trepidation. The decision had been made, but the reality of what lay ahead was beginning to set in. He had chosen love over luxury, a simple life over endless opulence, and now there was no turning back. The first few days in Cedar Creek were an adjustment, to say the least. Aiden moved into the modest farmhouse that Madison shared with her parents, Paul and Susan. The house was small but warm, filled with the sense of home-cooked meals and the laughter of a close-knit family. It was a far cry from the sprawling mansion he had been raised in, with its marble floors and polished chandeliers. But Aiden found comfort in the simplicity. For once there was no pressure to perform, no endless list of obligations, just a peaceful, quiet existence that he was still getting used to. Madison was there to guide him every step of the way. She understood how different this was for Aiden, and she was patient, teaching him the ins and outs of farm life. Every morning they woke up before dawn, the sky still dark, and went out to tend to the animals and crops. It was hard work, physically exhausting in a way Aiden had never experienced. His hands, once used to handling sleek smartphones and leather-bound portfolios, were now rough and calloused from carrying heavy feed sacks and repairing fences. But there was a sense of satisfaction in the work, a kind of fulfillment he hadn't felt in the corporate world. On their first morning together, Madison showed Aiden how to milk the cows. He fumbled awkwardly at first, unsure of what he was doing, but Madison was right beside him, guiding his hands and laughing gently at his clumsy attempts. "You'll get the hang of it," she said, her voice encouraging. "It's all about patience and practice." And she was right. Slowly, Aiden began to find a rhythm. He learned how to plow the fields, feed the chickens, and even fix the old tractor that Paul had been struggling with for weeks. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was honest. And that's what Aiden loved about it. There was no pretense here. No need to impress anyone. He was free to be himself, to make mistakes and learn at his own pace. Despite the warmth and welcome from Madison and her family, Aiden couldn't ignore the whispers and curious glances from others in the village. Cedar Creek was a small community, and word had spread quickly about the city boy. who had left behind a fortune to live on a farm. Some people admired his decision, while others thought he was foolish. Aiden could feel their eyes on him whenever he went into town, their unspoken judgments following him as he picked up supplies or helped Madison at the local farmer's market, but he refused to let it bother him. He had made his choice and he was determined to prove that he could make it work. Madison's parents, Paul and Susan, were kind and welcoming, though Paul was initially skeptical of Aiden's intentions. He had heard about the Whitman name, and he worried that Aiden was just going through a phase that he would eventually tire of the hard work and leave Madison behind. But as the days turned into weeks, Paul began to see that Aiden was serious. He was up at dawn every day working alongside Madison, and he didn't shy away from the challenges. Slowly, Paul's wariness turned into a kind of reluctant respect. One evening after a long day of work, the family gathered around the dinner table. Susan had prepared a hearty meal, and the air was filled with the aroma of freshly baked bread. As they ate, Paul glanced across the table at Aiden, who was quietly enjoying his meal. "You're not what I expected," Paul said suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence. Aiden looked up surprised. "What do you mean?" he asked, his brow furrowing slightly. "I mean, I've seen a lot of people come through this town thinking they could handle farm life, but most of them don't last more than a few days. They're not cut out for it," Paul said, his tone even. "But you're sticking around. That takes guts." Aiden smiled, a bit of relief washing over him. "I'm not afraid of hard work," he said. "I want to be here with Madison. That's all that matters to me." Paul nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Good. Because if you're going to be part of this family, you need to earn your place. And from what I've seen, you're doing just that." It was a small gesture, but to Aiden it felt like a major victory. Gaining Paul's approval was an important step, and it reassured him that he was on the right path. Madison squeezed his hand under the table, her eyes shining with pride. She knew how hard Aiden had been working, and it meant everything to her that he was being accepted by her family. The days continued to pass, and with each one, Aiden grew more comfortable in his new life. He and Madison worked side by side, fixing up the farmhouse, tending to the crops and making plans for the future. They talked about how they could improve the farm, maybe expand their produce and start selling to more markets. Madison's knowledge of the land and Aiden's business acumen made them a strong team, and they began to see the potential that Cedar Creek held. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. There were challenges that tested Aiden's resolve. One particularly hot afternoon, a pipe burst in the irrigation system, threatening to ruin an entire crop. Aiden and Paul spent hours in the sweltering sun digging trenches and repairing the damage. By the time they were finished, Aiden was drenched in sweat, his muscles aching. But the crops were saved. Moments like these were tough, but they also brought a sense of accomplishment that Aiden had never felt in his previous life. Each night, Aiden and Madison would sit on the porch, watching the sunset and reflecting on the day's work. They would talk about their dreams, their plans, and the life they were building together. It was simple, but it was theirs, and that made all the difference. One evening, as they sat in their usual spot, Madison turned to Aiden and said, "I'm glad you're here. I know it's not easy and I know you've given up a lot, but I'm really happy." Aiden smiled, feeling a warmth spread through his chest. "So am I," he said. "I've never been happier. This is where I want to be with you." As they watched the stars begin to twinkle in the night sky, Aiden realized just how much he had changed in such a short time. He was no longer the unsure, conflicted man who had been torn between his father's expectations and his own desires. He was building a life on his own terms, and for the first time he felt truly free. But as much as Aiden had embraced this new chapter, there was still an unspoken tension lingering in the background. Jack Whitman had not taken kindly to being defied, and Aiden knew it was only a matter of time before his father made another move. For now, though, he pushed those thoughts aside, choosing instead to focus on the present. The warm summer nights, the hard but rewarding days, and the love that he had found in the most unexpected of places. The honeymoon phase of Aiden's new life didn't last long after the initial excitement of adapting to the farm. Reality began to set in. Running a farm wasn't just about waking up early and putting in hard work. It was a constant battle against nature, finances, and the unexpected problems that could pop up at any moment. Madison had warned him that it wouldn't be easy, but Aiden was learning this lesson firsthand. The financial strain was the first major challenge. Madison's family had been struggling to keep the farm afloat for years. They were just managing to break even, and every month seemed like a tightrope walk, trying to balance expenses with income. The Whitman fortune had once been a safety net for Aiden, but now that was gone. He was living on savings, and for the first time, he felt the weight of financial insecurity pressing down on him. Every cent counted and every decision had to be made carefully. One particularly difficult morning, Aiden and Madison sat at the kitchen table, poring over the farm's books. The numbers weren't adding up, and it was clear they needed to find a way to bring in more income or face the possibility of losing the farm. Madison's face was tight with concern. Her brow furrowed as she tried to find a solution. "We're going to have to cut back on a few things," she said quietly, tapping her pencil against the edge of the table. "Maybe delay some of the repairs we planned." Aiden nodded, but inside he felt a surge of frustration. He wasn't used to this kind of struggle. Growing up, money had always been there, an endless resource that solved problems before they even began. Now he was seeing the other side of life, where every decision felt like a gamble and every misstep had real consequences. "We'll figure it out," he said, trying to sound optimistic. But his words felt hollow even to him. "Maybe we can sell some of the extra produce to the market this weekend. See if we can bring in a bit more cash." Madison gave him a small smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "It's worth a try," she said. But even then it might not be enough. Days turned into weeks and the financial strain was only one of the issues they had to deal with. The weather had been unpredictable, with a late, fast damaging some of their early crops. Equipment broke down at the worst possible times, and the repairs ate into their already stretched budget. Every time they seemed to take a step forward, something would push them 2 steps back. Aiden was beginning to understand why so many people had given up on farming. It was relentless, demanding, and unforgiving, and as much as he tried to stay positive, there were moments when he questioned if he had made the right choice. Late at night, when the house was quiet and Madison was asleep beside him, he would stare at the ceiling, his mind racing with doubts. Had he been too impulsive, or was he putting too much on Madison's shoulders by being here trying to make this work? What if his father had been right and he was just setting himself up for failure? One evening, after a particularly grueling day, Aiden found himself alone in the barn, taking a break from fixing a fence that had been knocked down by a recent storm. He leaned against the wooden beams, wiping sweat from his brow, and let out a heavy sigh. The doubts that he had been suppressing came rushing to the surface, and for the first time he allowed himself to confront them. "What am I doing?" he muttered to himself, his voice barely audible. "Maybe I'm not cut out for this." Unbeknownst to him, Madison had come to check on him. She stood at the entrance of the barn, watching him with a mix of concern and empathy. She had seen the way he had been pushing himself, taking on more and more responsibilities, trying to prove that he could handle this new life. And while she admired his determination, she also knew he was struggling. "Aiden," she said softly, stepping into the barn. He looked up, startled, and quickly tried to compose himself, but she had already seen the weariness in his eyes. "Hey," she continued, her tone gentle. "It's okay to feel overwhelmed. This isn't easy. I never said it would be. Aiden hesitated, struggling to find the right words. "I don't want to let you down. I don't want to let your family down. What if I'm not good enough to make this work?" Madison's heart ached at his words. She walked over to him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You're not letting anyone down," she said firmly. "You're doing everything you can. And that's all I could ever ask for. We're in this together, remember?" Aiden nodded, but he still felt a pang of uncertainty. "I just don't want to fail," he said quietly. "I've never been in a situation where there wasn't a way out, but here there's no safety net. If this doesn't work, we lose everything." Madison took a deep breath, understanding his fears. "I know," she said, "but that's why it matters so much. Because we're building something real, something we can be proud of. And yes, it's scary and it's hard. But we're not alone. We have each other and we have this community. We'll find a way. Aiden, I believe in that." Her words were like a balm to his frayed nerves. Aiden felt a wave of gratitude for Madison, for her strength, and for her unwavering belief in what they were trying to build. He pulled her into a hug, holding her close, and for a moment the weight on his shoulders felt a little lighter. "You're amazing, you know that?" he said, his voice muffled against her hair. "I don't know what I'd do without you." Madison smiled, pulling back just enough to look him in the eyes. "You'd figure it out," she said with a teasing grin. "But luckily you don't have to, because we're going to figure it out together." The conversation left Aiden feeling more grounded, but the challenges were far from over. The next few days brought more complications, machinery failures, more unexpected expenses, and a growing sense of urgency as they tried to prepare for the upcoming harvest. But Madison's words stuck with him, and whenever he felt the doubts creeping back, he reminded himself that he wasn't facing this alone. They began to brainstorm ways to increase the farm's income. Madison suggested reaching out to some local businesses to see if they could supply fresh produce directly. Cutting out the middleman, Aiden, drawing on his experience in business, started working on a plan to market the farm's produce more effectively, creating a small brand that emphasized quality and sustainability. It was a long shot, but it was a start, and it gave them something to work towards. As the days passed, Aiden and Madison began to fall into a rhythm. The work was still hard and the future still felt uncertain, but they were moving forward. Slowly but surely, they started to see small victories. A new client here. A repaired piece of equipment there. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep them going. One evening, as they sat on the porch after another exhausting day, Aiden glanced over at Madison, who was sipping a cup of tea and watching the sun dip below the horizon. "I think we're going to make it," he said quietly, more to himself than to her. "I don't know how, but I feel like we will." Madison turned to him, a soft smile on her lips. "I know we will," she said, "because we're not giving up. And as long as we keep fighting, there's always hope." It was a simple statement, but it was enough to reignite the spark of determination within Aiden. The road ahead was still long and there were sure to be more challenges, but he was ready to face them. For Madison, for her family, and for the life they were building together, he would keep fighting. The days were long and the work was tough, but Aiden and Madison refused to back down. They had taken on the challenge of running the farm together, and slowly, bit by bit, they began to see the fruits of their labor. Cedar Creek might not have been the bustling city Aiden was used to, but it had a way of teaching him lessons he would never have learned behind a desk in a skyscraper. Started with small changes. Madison's family had always managed to get by, but Aiden's experience in business gave him a fresh perspective. He began to look at the farm differently, seeing opportunities where others saw problems. One of the first things he suggested was diversifying their crops. Madison's family had been growing the same vegetables for years, but Aiden believed that adding a few new items could attract different buyers and help stabilize their income. "I was thinking," Aiden said one morning as he and Madison were planting seeds in the field, "what if we added a few more crops, maybe some berries or herbs? They don't take up much space, and I read that they're pretty popular at the local market." Madison looked up from her work, a glint of curiosity in her eyes. "That's actually a great idea," she said. "We've always stuck to the basics because they're reliable, but it might be worth trying something new. It's a bit of a risk, but I trust your instincts." Encouraged by her support, Aiden began planning out how they could make it work. He spent hours researching which crops would grow best in Cedar Creek's climate, talking to local farmers and figuring out the logistics of planting, harvesting, and selling them. It was a lot of work, but it was the kind of work that made him feel alive. For the first time in a long time, he was excited about what he was doing. Madison's family had always been frugal, but Aiden realized that sometimes spending a little more upfront could lead to bigger gains in the long run. He convinced Paul to invest in a few pieces of equipment that would make their work more efficient. It wasn't easy. Paul was hesitant, worried about taking on more expenses when money was already tight, but eventually he agreed. "If this doesn't pay off, it's on you, city boy," Paul said with a grin. Though there was a hint of seriousness behind his words, Aiden laughed, feeling the weight of that responsibility. "I know," he said, "and am willing to take that risk with the new equipment." They were able to speed up their work and focus more on the things that would make the farm profitable. Madison showed Aiden how to operate the machines, and after a few mishaps like accidentally spraying water all over himself instead of the plants, he finally got the hang of it. It wasn't just about getting the job done. It was about working smarter, not harder. The next big step was marketing. Madison had always sold their produce at the local farmers market, but it was inconsistent. Some weeks were great and others were barely worth the effort. Aiden saw an opportunity to turn that around. He proposed creating a small brand for their farm, something that would stand out and attract regular customers. We could call it Cedar Creek Organics. Aiden suggested one evening as they sat on the porch, the cool night breeze brushing against their skin. We can focus on quality and sustainability. People love that kind of thing. If we can get a few local stores to stock our products, it'll be a steady income. Madison's eyes lit up. I love it, she said. And I think people would respond well to it. We just need to make sure we're consistent with the quality. Aiden spent the next few weeks designing labels, creating flyers and reaching out to local business owners. He used every bit of knowledge he had gained from his time at Whitman Enterprises, applying marketing strategies to their small operation. At first it felt strange, like he was blending two completely different worlds. But as the days went on, it started to make sense. The farm was a business just like any other. And with the right approach, it could thrive. There were still setbacks, of course. One morning they discovered that a section of their crops had been damaged by pests, setting them back days of work. Aiden and Madison scrambled to save what they could. But the loss was a reminder of how fragile their progress was. It was frustrating, but it only made them more determined. It's just a bump in the road, Madison said, her voice resolute as they surveyed the damage. We'll get through it. We always do. And they did. Despite the challenges, they managed to get their new crops planted. And by the time summer was in full swing, they had a small but thriving variety of vegetables, herbs, and berries. They set up a stand at the local farmers market with their new Cedar Creek Organics branding. And to their delight, people started to take notice. "I'll take a pint of those strawberries," a customer said, pointing to the neatly arranged baskets on their table. "I heard they're the best in the area." Hearing that made Aiden's heart swell with pride. It was a small victory, but it felt huge. Slowly, the brand began to grow. They got a few local grocery stores to stock their produce, and orders started coming in more regularly. It wasn't a windfall, but it was progress. And that's all they needed. One afternoon after finishing up at the market, Madison turned to Aiden, her eyes bright with excitement. "I think we're really doing it," she said, almost as if she couldn't believe it. "We're actually making this work." Aiden smiled, feeling the warmth of her words wash over him. "Yeah," he said softly. "I think we are back on the farm." They began to plan for the future. Madison's parents, who had been cautiously optimistic about the changes, started to fully embrace the new direction. Paul even suggested expanding their operations, planting a few more acres next season if things continue to go well. "If you two keep this up, we might just have to hire more help," Paul joked. But there was a glint of hope in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Aiden felt a sense of satisfaction that he had never experienced in his previous life. This was different from closing a big business deal or seeing a stock price rise. This was real, tangible success, built from the ground up with his own hands and the hands of the woman he loved. As the days turned into weeks, Cedar Creek Organics became a small but notable name in the community. They had found their niche, and though there was still a lot of work to do, the farm was finally on a stable path. Aiden and Madison worked side by side every day, and every night they would sit on the porch, exhausted but content, talking about their plans and dreaming about what could come next. There was still a long road ahead, and Aiden knew that the challenges would keep coming. But for now, he allowed himself to enjoy the moment, to take pride in what they had achieved. He had chosen a different path from the one his father had laid out for him, and though it had been difficult, it was turning out to be the best decision he had ever made. One evening, as they watched the sun dip below the horizon, Aiden turned to Madison, a thoughtful look on his face. "You know, I used to think that success was all about money and power," he said quietly. "But now I see it's more than that. It's about building something you care about with people you care about." Madison smiled, resting her head on his shoulder. "That's the kind of success that lasts," she said. "And I'm glad we're building it together." As the stars began to appear in the night sky, Aiden felt a sense of peace that he hadn't known was possible. The farm was thriving. Cedar Creek was starting to feel like home. And for the first time in his life, he felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Back in the city, life continued as usual for Jack Whitman, but the absence of his son was a wound that hadn't fully healed on the surface. Jack acted as though nothing had changed. He still attended business meetings, hosted lavish events, and made deals that only seemed to increase the empire he had built. But every now and then, His mind would drift to Aiden and a surge of frustration would bubble up within him. How could his son be so foolish? How could he throw away everything for a life on a farm to Jack? It was inconceivable. He had sacrificed so much to build Whitman Enterprises, and he had done it all for Aiden. The plan had always been for Aiden to take over, to continue expanding the business, and to secure their family's legacy for generations to come. But Aiden had thrown it all away for what Jack saw as a passing whim. A farm of all things. Jack couldn't understand why his son would make such a choice. And he convinced himself that it was only a matter of time before Aiden would come crawling back. As the weeks turned into months, Jack received the occasional update from friends or acquaintances who had heard about Aiden's new life in Cedar Creek. The news was never flattering. People would whisper about how Aiden was struggling, how he had traded his suits for overalls and was barely making ends meet. Jack would nod and listen, his expression unreadable. But deep down he felt a bitter sense of satisfaction. He had warned Aiden. He had told him this would happen. And now it seemed like he was being proven right. One afternoon, Jack was having lunch with a few old business associates when the topic of Aiden inevitably came up. One of the men, a close friend of Jack's, leaned in and said, "So I hear your son's still out there playing farmer. How's that working out for him?" Jack's jaw tightened, but he forced a smile. "As far as I know, he's still in Cedar Creek," he replied. "But it's only a matter of time before he realizes he made a mistake. He'll come back." "You're probably right." Another man chimed in, chuckling. "I mean, really? How long can you keep that up? Farming is hard work and it doesn't pay nearly as well as running a business like yours." Jack's smile faltered slightly, but he didn't let it show. "Exactly," he said, his tone cool. "Aiden is young. He's still figuring things out. But once he realizes the reality of his situation, he'll come to his senses." Deep down though, Jack wasn't entirely sure. The longer Aiden stayed away, the more Jack began to wonder if he had underestimated his son's resolve. It was one thing to walk away in a moment of defiance, but Aiden had been gone for months now, and he hadn't reached out not even once. Jack's mind flickered with images of Aiden returning home, weary and defeated, ready to beg for forgiveness. But that hadn't happened. And the longer it didn't, the more Jack's frustration grew. Eventually, Jack's curiosity got the better of him. He decided to make an unannounced visit to Cedar Creek. He told himself it was to check on Aiden, to see if he could offer some support and convince him to come back. But in truth, he wanted to see for himself how Aiden was faring. He wanted to confirm that his son was struggling, that he was barely getting by, and that he would need Jack's help to dig himself out of the mess he had chosen. As he drove through the winding roads leading to Cedar Creek, Jack couldn't help but feel out of place. The city was his domain. The bustling streets, the towering skyscrapers, the endless rush of people and power. But here everything was slower, quieter. It made him uncomfortable. He hadn't been to Cedar Creek in years, and he found it hard to believe that Aiden had chosen to live here. The last time he had come through these parts was for a corporate retreat, and he had barely paid attention to the town. Now, as he passed by the small shops and modest homes, he felt like a stranger. Jack eventually arrived at the farm, expecting to find a scene of disarray. He imagined rundown buildings, overgrown fields, and a tired, worn-out version of Aiden, who would be all too eager to admit that he needed help. But what he saw instead left him speechless. The farm was thriving. The fields were neatly cultivated, rows of green stretching out as far as the eye could see. A small sign by the entrance read Cedar Creek Organics, with a simple but elegant design that caught Jack's eye. There was a sense of order and purpose, something he hadn't anticipated. Workers moved around, tending to the crops, and there was a quiet hum of activity that spoke of productivity and care. Jack hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected to see a well-run operation, much less one that seemed successful for a moment. Jack just sat in his car staring. He felt a mix of emotions that he couldn't quite process. Part of him was impressed. Aiden had clearly managed to build something here. But another part of him felt a pang of disappointment because it wasn't supposed to be this way. Aiden was supposed to fail. He was supposed to realize that life on the farm was hard, that it wasn't sustainable and that he needed to come back. But instead it seemed like Aiden had managed to do the impossible. Stepping out of the car, Jack walked up to the farmhouse and where he saw Aiden talking to a few of the workers. Aiden hadn't noticed him yet, and Jack took a moment to observe his son. There was a confidence in Aiden's posture, a sense of ease that Jack hadn't seen before. It was as if the weight that had always been on Aiden's shoulders had been lifted. He looked happy, and that realization hit Jack harder than he expected. Aiden turned and his eyes widened when he saw his father standing there for a moment. There was a flicker of surprise, but then he composed himself. "Dad," he said, walking over to greet him. "What are you doing here?" "I came to see you," Jack said, his voice measured. "I wanted to check on you, see how you were doing." "Well, as you can see, we're doing fine," Aiden replied, gesturing to the bustling farm around them. "Actually, we're doing more than fine. The farm is growing, and Cedar Creek Organics is starting to make a name for itself." Jack's lips pressed into a thin line. "So it seems," he said, struggling to hide his confusion. "I'll admit I wasn't expecting this, I thought you might have changed your mind by now." Aiden's expression softened, but there was a firmness in his eyes. "I haven't changed my mind, Dad. This is my life now. Madison and I have worked hard to make this place what it is, and I'm proud of that." There was a long pause as Jack tried to process everything. He wanted to say something, anything to convince Aiden to come back, but he couldn't find the words. He had been so sure that Aiden would fail. But now he was faced with the reality that his son had succeeded, and he didn't know how to handle it. "I see," Jack said finally, his voice low. "Well, if that's how you feel, I suppose there's nothing more to say, Dad. Why can't you just be happy for me?" Aiden asked, his voice tinged with sadness. "I know this isn't what you wanted, but it's what I want. Can't that be enough?" Jack's heart clenched at the question. He had spent his entire life building an empire, and he had always assumed that Aiden would be the one to carry it forward. But now, seeing his son standing there proud and content in a way Jack had never been, he began to wonder if he had been wrong all along. "I don't know," Jack said quietly, the words slipping out before he could stop them. "I just don't know." Without another word, Jack turned and walked back to his car as he drove away from the farm. He felt a heavy weight settle in his chest for the first time. He wasn't sure if he wanted Aiden to come back. Part of him still believed that Aiden was making a mistake. But another part, a small silent part, was beginning to see that maybe, just maybe, Aiden had found something that Jack never could. And that realization was far more unsettling than he could have ever imagined. The days after Jack's visit were a turning point for Aiden, seeing his father's reaction. The mixture of disbelief and confusion had been difficult. Aiden knew that Jack had come expecting to find a failure, but instead he had been faced with a reality he hadn't prepared for. Aiden was succeeding on his own terms, and Jack didn't know how to process it. Despite the awkward encounter, Aiden felt more determined than ever. He was no longer trying to prove something to his father. He was building a life that made him happy. Cedar Creek Organics was growing, and with Madison by his side, Aiden felt like they could accomplish anything. But with growth came new challenges, and Aiden knew they couldn't rest easy just yet. One of the biggest hurdles was expanding their reach. The local farmers market was a great place to sell their produce, but it was limited. If they wanted to keep growing, they needed to find new avenues. Aiden and Madison had been discussing this for weeks, brainstorming ideas on how to take Cedar Creek Organics to the next level. "I was thinking," Madison said one afternoon as they sat under the shade of a large oak tree, taking a break from the heat, "maybe we could reach out to some local restaurants, see if they'd be interested in using our produce. Could be a steady source of income, and it would help get our name out there." Aiden nodded, considering her suggestion. "That's a great idea," he said. "We could even offer them a subscription service. Deliver fresh produce weekly. It would save them the hassle of sourcing ingredients, and we'd have a guaranteed buyer." Madison's eyes lit up. "Yes, and we can highlight that everything is organic and locally grown. People love that." Encouraged by their plan, Aiden started reaching out to a few restaurant owners in nearby towns. He used the same approach he had learned from his business days, crafting emails, setting up meetings, and preparing samples of their best products. Madison accompanied him, and together they made a convincing team. Aiden with his polished pitch, and Madison with her deep knowledge of the produce they were offering. The response was better than they had hoped. Within a few weeks, they had secured deals with 2 local restaurants, both of which were eager to promote the fact that they were using fresh, organic produce from a local farm. It was a small but significant step forward, and it brought in enough steady income to help ease some of the financial strain they had been feeling as they started to see the fruits of their labor. Aiden and Madison decided to reinvest their profits back into the farm. They upgraded some of their equipment, bought new seeds, and even hired a few more workers to help with the increasing workload. The farm was buzzing with activity, and for the first time, Aiden felt like they were truly building something sustainable. But the turning point wasn't just about business. The changes also brought a renewed sense of community. Cedar Creek was a small town and word spread quickly. People started to see Aiden, not just as the city boy who left it all behind, but as a committed part of the community. The local grocer began stocking their produce, and the coffee shop down the road started using their fresh berries for their pastries. It felt like a wave of support, and it fueled Aiden's determination to keep pushing forward. One morning, Aiden and Madison were walking through the fields, checking on the new crops they had planted. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a warm glow over the rows of vegetables, and there was a crisp, fresh scent in the air that made everything feel full of possibility. "I can't believe how far we've come," Madison said, her voice soft with wonder. "Do you remember when we were just trying to make ends meet?" Aiden smiled, reaching out to take her hand. "Yeah," he said. "And look at us now. It's still a lot of work, but we're making it happen together." Madison squeezed his hand, her eyes bright. "I'm proud of you, Aiden. I know this hasn't been easy, but you've really made a difference. Not just here on the farm, but in the community." Aiden felt a swell of emotion at her words. "I couldn't have done it without you," he said. "You've taught me so much and you've been there every step of the way. I'm proud of us." The expansion of Cedar Creek Organics continued, and soon they were able to take on larger projects. One of the restaurants they were working with, a popular farm-to-table place in the neighboring town, offered to feature their farm in a local food magazine. It was an opportunity they couldn't pass up, and Aiden and Madison eagerly agreed. The day of the photo shoot, the farm was a hive of activity. Workers were busy preparing the fields, and the photographer snapped pictures of the crops. The workers and of course Aiden and Madison. It was surreal for Aiden to see their small farm being recognized like this, and he couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. When the article was published, it painted Cedar Creek Organics in a glowing light. The headline read, "From City to Soil: How a Former Corporate Heir Found Success on a Small Farm." The piece highlighted Aiden's decision to leave his corporate life behind and embrace farming, and it praised Madison's expertise and the way they had managed to build something meaningful together. The article brought in a new wave of interest. People from nearby towns started visiting the farm stand, curious to see what Cedar Creek Organics was all about. Some came to buy fresh produce, while others just wanted to meet the couple who had managed to defy the odds. Aiden was surprised by how many people were fascinated by his story, but he was happy to share it, especially if it meant more support for the farm. Things were finally looking up, but Aiden couldn't help but think back to Jack's visit. He hadn't heard from his father since that day, and there was a part of him that wondered how Jack had felt after seeing the farm's success. Aiden knew that Jack was stubborn, but he also knew that his father was proud. It was a complicated mix of emotions, but for now, Aiden chose to focus on the present and the positive momentum they were building. As the summer drew to a close, Aiden and Madison decided to host a small harvest festival on the farm. It was a way to thank the community for their support and celebrate the success they had achieved together. They set up tables with fresh produce, organized games for the kids, and even invited a local band to play music. It was a simple, joyful event, and the turnout was better than they had expected. Standing in the middle of the crowd, Aiden looked around at the smiling faces, the families enjoying the day, and the vibrant colors of the produce on display. It was everything he had ever hoped for. Madison was by his side, laughing as she chatted with one of the local chefs who had come to pick up a fresh delivery, and Aiden felt a deep sense of contentment. "This is what it's all about," he said quietly, more to himself than to anyone else. "This is why I chose this life." But as the festival went on, Aiden noticed a familiar face in the crowd. Standing a few yards away, looking slightly out of place in his suit, was Jack. Aiden's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't expected his father to come, especially not after their last conversation. Jack stood there for a moment watching the festivities. He looked around, taking in the sights and sounds, and for the first time he seemed to see Cedar Creek Organics for what it was: a thriving, successful business built from the ground up. His eyes softened slightly as he saw Aiden and Madison working together, and for a moment he hesitated, unsure whether to approach. But then he started walking forward, weaving through the crowd until he was standing in front of Aiden. "I see you've been busy," Jack said, his voice calm but carrying a hint of something Aiden hadn't heard before. Was it admiration? Aiden smiled, still a bit surprised to see his father there. "Yeah," he said, glancing around at the bustling scene. "We've been working hard." Jack nodded, his gaze following Aiden's. It shows for a long moment. Neither of them said anything. The tension that had defined their last conversation was still there, but it felt different now. Less like a confrontation and more like an opening. "I'm proud of you, Aiden," Jack said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't think you could do it, but I was wrong." The words hung in the air and Aiden felt a wave of emotion swirl within him. It was the acknowledgement he had been hoping for, but hadn't dared to expect. "Thanks, Dad," he said softly. "That means a lot." As the festival continued around them, Jack and Aiden stood there, caught in a moment of understanding. It wasn't a full reconciliation, but it was a step, a small tentative step towards something that might one day become more. Jack's unexpected visit to the Harvest Festival lingered in Aiden's mind long after the day had ended. Seeing his father there mingling quietly with the crowd had been surreal. It was as if for a brief moment, the barriers that had always stood between them had softened, but Jack hadn't stayed long. After their short exchange, he quietly slipped away, leaving Aiden with more questions than answers. Back in the city, Jack was trying to process what he had seen. The visit had left him conflicted. He had expected to find a struggling farm, an operation barely scraping by, confirming his belief that Aiden's decision had been a mistake. But instead he saw something entirely different. A thriving, vibrant business that had a life of its own. One that his son had built with his own hands. It made Jack question everything he thought he knew about success, legacy, and what it meant to be a Whitman. Jack had always been a man who believed in power, control, and maintaining a tight grip on everything. But standing in Cedar Creek, watching Aiden and Madison work side by side, he had seen a different kind of power, a quiet, steady resilience that didn't need to shout to be heard. It was a kind of power that came from passion, community, and a genuine love for what one did. And it was clear to Jack that Aiden had found something in Cedar Creek that he had never found in the city. Over the next few days, Jack's thoughts kept returning to the farm. He found himself replaying the moments he had observed Aiden speaking confidently to customers, Madison laughing with the children, the sense of camaraderie that filled the air. It was so different from the cutthroat world of corporate mergers and acquisitions that had defined Jack's life. He had built an empire, but at what cost? He realized that he had spent so much time trying to mold Aiden into a version of himself that he had failed to see who his son really was. Finally, unable to ignore the nagging thoughts any longer, Jack made a decision: he would return to Cedar Creek. This time it wouldn't be a surprise visit, and it wouldn't be about proving a point. Jack wanted to understand, to see if he could find a way to bridge the gap that had grown between him and Aiden. He wasn't sure what he would say or how things would unfold, but he knew he had to try. When Jack arrived in Cedar Creek a few days later, the air was crisp and cool, signaling the start of autumn. The drive felt different this time, less like a journey into unfamiliar territory, and more like a step towards something that had been missing. As he pulled up to the farmhouse, he saw Aiden standing outside talking to one of the workers. Aiden glanced up, caught sight of his father's car, and raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised but not displeased. "Dad?" Aiden said as Jack got out of the car. "I wasn't expecting you." Jack offered a small tentative smile. "I thought it was time we talked properly this time." Aiden hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "All right, let's talk." They walked towards the porch where Madison was arranging baskets of produce for delivery. She looked up, her expression brightening when she saw Jack. "Mr. Whitman," she said warmly. "It's nice to see you again." "Please call me Jack," he replied, slightly taken aback by her kindness. "And it's nice to see you too, Madison." As they settled on the porch, Jack took a moment to take in the scene. The farm was bustling with activity, but it was peaceful, a stark contrast to the constant rush of the city. For the first time, he allowed himself to appreciate the beauty of it, the way the field stretched out under the blue sky, the way the barn looked freshly painted, and the steady hum of life that surrounded them. I have to admit, Jack began, his voice measured. I didn't know what to expect when I came here the first time. But you've done well, Aiden. Better than I thought possible. Aiden wasn't sure how to respond. He had spent so long bracing himself for Jack's criticism that the compliment felt almost foreign. Thank you, he said cautiously. It hasn't been easy, but we've made it work. Jack nodded, glancing over at Madison, who had joined them at the table. I can see that, he said. And I can see how much this place means to you both. It's impressive. There was a pause, and for a moment the only sound was the gentle rustling of the trees in the breeze. Aiden decided to take the opportunity to address the elephant in the room. Dad, I know this isn't what you wanted for me, he said, his tone steady. But this is my life now. Madison and I have built something here and I'm proud of it. I hope you can understand that. Jack looked at his son, really looked at him, and for the first time he saw not just a young man trying to prove a point, but a man who had found his own way. I do understand, Jack said quietly. Or at least am trying to. When you walked away, I was angry because I thought you were throwing everything away. Everything I had worked for. Everything I thought mattered. But seeing this, I realized that maybe I was wrong. Maybe there are different ways to build something that lasts. Madison, who had been listening quietly, reached over and placed a hand on Aiden's arm. We've worked hard to make this place what it is, she said. Her voice filled with warmth. But it's not just about the business. It's about the life we're building together. The community we're a part of. That's what makes it special. Jack's gaze softened and he nodded. I see that now, he said. And I'm sorry, Aiden. I'm sorry for not understanding sooner. I wanted so much for you. And I thought I knew what was best. Aiden felt a pang of emotion as he listened to his father's words. It wasn't quite an apology, but it was more than he had ever expected. I know, Dad, he said. And I appreciate that. But what I want is here with Madison, with the farm. I'm not saying I don't care about the family business, but this is where I belong. Jack was silent for a moment. Then he took a deep breath. I want to help, he said, surprising both Aiden and himself. I don't mean taking over or anything like that. I want to see you succeed. And if there's anything I can do to support that, I'd like to try. Aiden's eyes widened slightly. This was the last thing he had expected. You don't have to do that, he said. We've managed so far, and I don't want you to feel like it's not about feeling obligated. Jack interrupted gently. It's about wanting to be a part of your life, Aiden. I missed out on a lot and I'd like to make up for that. If you'll let me. There was a long silence as Aiden processed what his father was saying. He glanced at Madison, who gave him a supportive nod, then turned back to Jack. "'Kay," he said finally. "We can figure it out together, but on our terms, not yours." Jack smiled a genuine, relieved smile. "On your terms," he agreed. "That sounds fair." As they sat there, a quiet understanding settled between them. It wasn't a perfect reconciliation, but it was a start for Jack. It was a humbling realization that he didn't have all the answers. And for Aiden, it was a step towards healing. A rift that had felt insurmountable. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of conversation. Jack listened as Aiden and Madison shared their plans for the farm, their dreams of expanding and reaching new markets. And he offered suggestions without overstepping. It was strange, almost surreal, but it felt good. For once, they were talking not as adversaries but as a family. Before he left, Jack stood by the car and turned to Aiden one last time. "You know, your grandfather once told me that the hardest thing about being a parent is letting go," he said. "I never really understood what he meant until now, but I think I'm starting to." Aiden didn't quite know how to respond, so he simply nodded. "Thanks, Dad, for coming." Jack nodded in return, and without another word, he got into his car and drove off as Aiden watched him disappear down the road. He felt a sense of closure, but also a new beginning. His father wasn't perfect, but he was trying. And that meant more than words could express. As the sun began to set, Aiden and Madison stood on the porch, watching the sky turn shades of pink and gold. "That went better than I expected." Madison's dad, leaning against Aiden's shoulder. "Yeah," Aiden said, a small smile tugging at his lips. "It did. Maybe things are starting to change." Madison slipped her hand into his. and they stood there side by side as the stars began to twinkle above them. For the first time in a long while, Aiden felt like everything was going to be okay. They had come so far and there was still so much more to do. But with Madison by his side and a chance to rebuild his relationship with his father, he felt ready to take on whatever came next. The weeks following Jack's visit were a strange blend of hope and uncertainty for Aiden. While he was relieved that his father seemed to be making an effort to understand, there was still an unspoken tension between them. They had made progress, but Aiden couldn't shake the feeling that Jack hadn't fully accepted his new life. He wanted to believe that things would get better, but he also knew that old habits die hard. And Jack was a man who rarely changed his mind. Meanwhile, Cedar Creek Organics continued to grow. The farm had seen a surge of new customers after the Harvest Festival, and Aiden and Madison were busier than ever. They had secured more deals with local restaurants, expanded their market presence, and even started exploring the possibility of selling their produce to larger stores in nearby towns. It was an exciting time but also exhausting, and there were days when it felt like they barely had time to catch their breath. One evening after a long day of work, Aiden received a phone call from Jack. He hadn't heard from his father since the last visit, so he was surprised to see his name flashing on the screen. "Hey Dad," Aiden said, answering the call. "What's up? I was hoping we could talk," Jack said, his tone serious. "There's something I want to discuss with you. Can you meet me at the farmhouse tomorrow morning?" Aiden hesitated. The tone in Jack's voice suggested this wasn't just a casual visit, but he couldn't tell if it was good or bad. "Yeah, sure," he said.
"I'll be there."
The next morning, Jack arrived at the farm earlier than expected. Aiden was still finishing up some chores, so Madison welcomed him in, offering a cup of coffee while they waited. Jack accepted the offer, but there was an air of tension about him, a stiffness that hadn't been there during his last visit when Aiden finally joined them. Jack got straight to the point. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said about wanting to build your own life here," he began, his eyes fixed on Aiden. "And I want you to know that I respect that. I really do. But I also think there's a way for us to find some common ground." Aiden exchanged a cautious glance with Madison, unsure where this was going. "What do you mean?" he asked. "I've been talking to some people," Jack continued, "and I think there's an opportunity here. Cedar Creek Organics has potential more than I initially thought, but there's only so much you can do on your own. If you're serious about growing this business, you'll need more resources, more connections, and that's where I can help." Aiden, stomach tightened. He could see where this was headed and he wasn't sure he liked it. "What kind of help are you offering?" he asked, his voice careful. "I want to invest," Jack said simply. "I can provide the funding you need to expand to reach markets beyond just the local community. We could turn Cedar Creek Organics into something much bigger, something that could really make a name for itself. But I'd need to be involved. Would need to make some changes to how things are run, streamline operations, bring in more experienced staff." Jack's words hung in the air, and for a moment there was complete silence. Aiden could feel Madison's hand tightened around his, and he knew she was thinking the same thing. This wasn't just about helping. It was about control. It was about taking over. "I appreciate the offer, Dad," Aiden said slowly, choosing his words carefully. "But this isn't what we want. Madison and I have worked hard to build this farm on our own terms, and I don't want to change that. We are growing and we're doing it in a way that feels right for us." Jack's expression darkened. "Aiden, be reasonable," he said, his voice edging towards frustration. "You can't grow a business with just hard work and good intentions. You need capital, infrastructure, connections. I can give you all of that. Why are you throwing away an opportunity to turn this into something bigger? Because bigger isn't always better." Aiden shot back, his own frustration rising. "I didn't leave the city to build another version of Whitman Enterprises. I left because I wanted something different, something that's mine. I'm not interested in scaling up just for the sake of it. Cedar Creek Organics is about quality, about community, and I'm not going to compromise that." Jack's eyes narrowed, and for a moment Aiden saw a flash of the same stubbornness he had inherited from his father. "You're being naive," Jack said, his tone sharp. "Do you think this little operation can survive in the long run without serious backing? You might be doing well now, but what happens when things get tough? When there's a bad season or the market changes? You need stability. and am offering you a way to get it. Aiden felt a surge of anger. He had spent months proving to himself, to Madison and to the community that he could make this work without his father's money, and now it felt like Jack was trying to undermine everything they had built. I appreciate your concern, but we're not interested in turning this farm into a corporation, Aiden said firmly. We're building something that matters to us, and am not going to let that be taken away. Madison, who had been silent up until now, finally spoke up. Mr. Whitman, she said, her voice calm but resolute. We respect everything you've done, and we know you want what's best for Aiden. But this farm is more than just a business. It's our home. It's a place where we can do things our way. And that's not something we're willing to change even for a bigger opportunity. Jack's gaze shifted to Madison, and for a moment he seemed taken aback by her quiet strength. I understand that you care about this place, he said, his tone softening slightly. But you're both thinking too small. You could be part of something much larger than this little farm. But we don't want to be, Aiden said, his voice firm. We're happy with what we're building. It may not be the biggest, but it's ours. And I'm not going to compromise that. No matter what you're offering. Jack's shoulders slumped, and for the first time, Aiden saw a hint of defeat in his father's eyes. I just don't want to see you struggle, Jack said quietly. I thought if I could help, if I could make things easier for you. Aiden's heart softened at the words for all of Jack's flaws. Aiden knew his father's intentions came from a place of love, even if they were misguided. I know, Dad, he said, his voice gentler now. But sometimes the struggle is part of the journey. It's what makes the success meaningful. We want to do this our way, even if it's harder. There was a long pause, and Jack seemed to weigh Aiden's words. Finally, he let out a slow, resigned sigh. I see, he said. I suppose I can't force you to accept my help, but what? I still want to support you in whatever way you'll allow. Aiden nodded, feeling a mix of relief and gratitude. That means a lot, Dad. Really? But support doesn't have to mean control. If you want to be involved, it has to be on our terms. Jack met his son's gaze, and for the first time, he understood what Aiden was saying. It wasn't about rejecting his help. It was about respecting the boundaries Aiden had set. All right, Jack said, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. On your terms, then? Madison smiled, her eyes bright with relief. Thank you, Jack. We really do appreciate it. As they sat there, a sense of understanding settled over them. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was a step forward for Jack. It was a moment of letting go, of realizing that sometimes supporting someone meant stepping back and letting them find their own way. And for Aiden, it was a reaffirmation of the life he had chosen, a chance to stand by the values he and Madison had built together. Before Jack left, he turned to Aiden one last time. I'll be in touch, he said. And if you ever change your mind, the offer is still there. Aiden smiled, a hint of warmth in his expression. I'll keep that in mind. But for now, I think we're doing just fine. As Jack drove away, Aiden and Madison stood on the porch watching the car disappear down the road. There was a sense of finality but also a feeling of hope. They had stood their ground, and in doing so they had found a new sense of confidence in what they were building. Cedar Creek Organics might not be the biggest business, but it was theirs. And that was enough. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Aiden took Madison's hand. We're going to be okay, he said softly. No matter what happens, we're going to make this work. Madison leaned her head against his shoulder, a content smile on her lips. I know, she said, and I'm so glad we're doing it together. The days grew shorter as autumn settled over Cedar Creek, painting the landscape with rich hues of red, orange, and gold. It was a busy time for the farm, as Aiden and Madison worked to prepare for the upcoming winter. They had made significant progress over the past few months, and despite the challenges, they were beginning to feel more secure in their plans for the future. But amidst the hard work, there was something else that had been occupying their thoughts. Something they hadn't yet shared with anyone. Aiden and Madison had been waiting for the right moment, and as the holidays approached, they decided it was time to bring their families together for a special dinner. It would be an opportunity to celebrate everything they had achieved, and to share the news that had been their joyful secret for weeks. The night of the dinner arrived and Madison was busy in the kitchen, preparing a feast that would highlight the best of what Cedar Creek Organics had to offer. The table was set with fresh produce from their farm, and the air was filled with the warm, inviting aroma of roasted vegetables, freshly baked bread and spice cider. Aiden had gone into town to pick up Jack, who had accepted the invitation. Despite his initial hesitation, when Aiden and Jack arrived, the farmhouse was already buzzing with life. Madison's parents, Paul and Susan, were there, along with a few close friends from the community who had supported the farm through thick and thin. Jack felt a bit out of place at first, surrounded by people who were so different from the business elites he was used to. But there was a warmth to the atmosphere that he couldn't help but appreciate. "Welcome, Mr. Whitman," Susan said, greeting Jack with a bright smile as he stepped through the door. "We're so glad you could join us." "Please call me Jack," he replied, offering a polite smile. "Thank you for having me." Aiden watched as Jack exchanged pleasantries with Madison's parents. Feeling a mixture of relief and nervousness, he knew this dinner was important not just for the farm, but for bridging the gap between two very different parts of his life. He was grateful that Jack had agreed to come, even if he still wasn't entirely sure how his father would react to what they were about to announce. As everyone gathered around the table, the conversation flowed easily. Madison and Aiden shared stories about their latest harvest, and Paul regaled the group with tales of his younger days working on the farm. Jack listened, sometimes joining in but mostly observing the dynamic between Aiden and the people who had become his new family. It was clear to him that Aiden had found a place where he belonged, and despite his reservations, Jack was beginning to understand why his son had chosen this life. Halfway through the meal, Madison caught Aiden's eye, giving him a subtle nod. It was time. Aiden set down his fork and cleared his throat, drawing the attention of everyone at the table. "We want to thank you all for being here tonight," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "It means a lot to us to have you all together, especially after everything we've been through this past year." Madison took his hand, smiling as she continued, "And we have some news that we're really excited to share with all of you." There was a brief pause, a moment of anticipation before Aiden finally said it. "Madison and I are expecting a baby." The room erupted in a chorus of surprised gasps, followed by cheers and congratulations. Susan immediately got up to hug Madison while Paul clapped Aiden on the back, his eyes twinkling with joy. "That's wonderful news," he said, his grin wide. "I always knew you two would start a family one day." Jack sat there momentarily stunned. He hadn't seen this coming, and for a few seconds he struggled to process the announcement. A baby, his son was going to be a father. It was as if the reality of Aiden's new life had suddenly become more tangible, more permanent. He glanced at Aiden, who was beaming, and something inside him shifted. "Congratulations, Aiden," Jack said finally, his voice softer than usual. That's wonderful news." Aiden smiled, relief washing over him. "Thank you, Dad. It means a lot to have your support." As the evening continued, the mood around the table was jubilant. People raised their glasses to toast the new parents-to-be, and Madison's friends began speculating on whether the baby would inherit Aiden's dark hair or Madison's bright smile. For Aiden, it was a moment of pure happiness, surrounded by the people he cared about, celebrating a future that was beginning to take shape. But amidst the joy, Jack felt a pang of regret. He had spent so much time trying to mold Aiden into his own image, pushing him towards a life he thought was best, that he had never stopped to consider what his son truly wanted. And now here was Aiden about to become a father, building a life that was entirely his own. It was a life that Jack had once seen as a failure, but now he realized it was anything but. Aiden had found success not in terms of wealth or power, but in love, family, and community. After dessert was served, Jack excused himself and stepped out onto the porch, needing a moment to collect his thoughts. The cool night air was a welcome relief, and he took a deep breath, trying to make sense of everything he was feeling. He hadn't expected to be so affected by the news, but there was no denying the emotions that had been stirred within him. A few minutes later, Aiden joined him, closing the door quietly behind him. "You okay, Dad?" he asked, concern evident in his voice. Jack nodded, but he didn't turn to face Aiden. "I'm fine," he said, though his voice was thick with emotion. "I just needed a moment." There was a long silence, and then Jack spoke again, his words barely more than a whisper. "I'm sorry, Aiden. I'm sorry for the way I handled things, for trying to push you into a life you didn't want. I thought I was doing what was best, but I see now that I was wrong. You've built something here, something real. And I'm proud of you for that. Aiden's heart ached at the sincerity in his father's voice. It was the closest Jack had ever come to an apology, and it meant more to him than he could put into words. Thank you, Dad, he said softly. I know you were just trying to look out for me, and I appreciate that, but I'm glad you're starting to see why this is important to me. Jack finally turned to face Aiden, his eyes glistening in the dim light. I'm not just starting to see it. I do see it, and I want to be part of it if you'll let me. I don't know what that looks like yet, but I want to try. Aiden felt a lump forming his throat as he listened to his father's words. This was what he had been hoping for, even if he hadn't dared to expect it. Of course, Dad, he said, his voice breaking slightly. We'd love to have you be a part of this. Madison and we want you to be in our child's life. Jack smiled a small, genuine smile that Aiden hadn't seen in a long time. I do like that, he said. I do like that very much. The two of them stood there on the porch, the chill of the night air forgotten as they shared a moment of quiet reconciliation. For Aiden, it was a sign that things were finally starting to change, that maybe, just maybe, they could build a new kind of relationship, one based on mutual respect and understanding rather than expectations and obligations. When they returned to the warmth of the farmhouse, they found Madison laughing with Susan as they planned out baby names, and Paul was pouring another round of cider for the guests. The night felt perfect, like everything was falling into place. For the first time in a long while, Aiden felt a sense of peace about the future. As the evening wound down and the guests began to leave, Jack approached Madison, who was tidying up the table. Congratulations, Madison, he said, his tone warm. You're going to be a wonderful mother. Madison looked up, surprised but touched by the sentiment. Thank you, Jack, she said, smiling. That means a lot. Jack hesitated, then added, and if there's ever anything you need, anything at all, I'm here. Madison's eyes softened and she nodded. We appreciate that, Jack. Really? As Jack prepared to leave, he took one last look around the farmhouse at the people who had come together to celebrate a new chapter in Aiden's life. It wasn't the legacy he had envisioned, but it was something real, something enduring. And maybe in its own way it was even better. Winter arrived in Cedar Creek, bringing a blanket of frost that glistened on the fields each morning. The farm had quieted down after the busy harvest season, and Aiden and Madison found themselves with a rare moment to breathe as they prepared for the colder months. They also began planning for the future, one that now included their growing family. The news of Madison's pregnancy had brought a wave of joy, not just to the farm, but to the entire community. Friends, neighbors, and even customers at the local market had congratulated them, offering words of encouragement, advice, and the occasional knitted baby blanket. It was clear that Cedar Creek was more than just a place to live. It was a community that embraced them, and it was here that they would raise their child. Jack, true to his word, had begun making an effort to be more present in Aiden's life. He visited the farm regularly, sometimes to talk business, but mostly just to spend time with his son and Madison. He had even started helping with small tasks around the farm, much to Aiden's amusement. It was strange at first, seeing Jack in work boots and a flannel shirt instead of his usual suit, but it was a change that Aiden welcomed. It felt like a sign that his father was truly trying to understand and be a part of this new chapter. One crisp morning, as Aiden and Jack were repairing a fence line that had been damaged by a recent storm, Jack turned to his son, a thoughtful expression on his face. You know, he said, wiping sweat from his brow, I've been thinking a lot about what you said that night about building something meaningful. Aiden glanced at his father. Curious? Yeah. Jack nodded. I've spent my whole life chasing success. Money, power, influence. And I thought that was the only way to make a mark in the world. But seeing what you've built here, it's made me realize that maybe I missed out on something important. It's not just about what you have, but what you build with it and who you build it with. Aiden felt a surge of emotion as he listened to his father's words. It was the kind of admission he never thought he would hear from Jack, and it meant more to him than he could say. I'm glad you see that, Dad, he said softly, because that's what this is all about for us. It's about family and making something real. Jack smiled, a wistful look in his eyes. I wish I'd realized it sooner, he said. But I'm here now and I want to help you build this. However I can. Aiden hesitated, then took a deep breath. Actually, there is something I've been thinking about. Madison and I have been talking about expanding the farm again, maybe adding a small shop where we can sell our produce, homemade goods, things like that. But it's a big project and we could use some advice. Jack's eyes lit up with interest. I'd be happy to help, he said. I can look over your plans, help with the logistics, even introduce you to a few people who might be interested in partnering. On your terms, of course. Aiden smiled, feeling a warmth spread through his chest. I'd like that, he said. Thank you, Dad. It was a simple exchange, but it felt like a breakthrough. For the first time, Jack was offering his expertise not as a way to control, but as a way to support. And Aiden, in turn, was willing to accept that support, knowing that it came from a place of understanding rather than obligation. As winter turned to spring, Aiden and Madison's plans for the farm began to take shape. They set up a small shop on the edge of their property, where they could sell fresh produce, jams, honey and other goods made from the farm's bounty. It was a modest space, but it quickly became a favorite spot for locals who loved the idea of buying directly from the source. Madison's parents helped with the baking, while a few friends from town pitched in to keep the shop running smoothly. The success of the shop was a testament to how far they had come, and it brought a renewed sense of purpose to the farm. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about thriving, about creating something that could be passed down to their child. And as Aiden watched the shop grow, he felt a sense of fulfillment that he had never found in his old life. One afternoon, as Aiden and Madison were setting up the new shelves in the shop, Jack walked in carrying a small box. I bought something, he said, setting it down on the counter. I thought it might be a nice addition. Curious, Madison opened the box and found a set of beautifully engraved wooden signs, each one labeled with the name of the different produce they sold. There was a sign for Cedar Creek organic tomatoes, another for homemade strawberry jam, and even one for the fresh herbs they had just started growing. The craftsmanship was exquisite, and it was clear that a lot of thought had gone into each piece. They're beautiful, Madison said, her eyes shining. Thank you, Jack. Jack smiled a bit sheepishly. I wanted to do something to show that I'm proud of what you've built here, he said. I know I haven't always been the most supportive, but am learning. Aiden felt a lump form in his throat as he looked at the signs. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. They're perfect, he said. Thank you. The days grew warmer, and soon Madison's pregnancy was beginning to show as her belly rounded and the baby's kicks became more pronounced. Aiden found himself growing more excited and more nervous about becoming a father. He had spent so much time focused on building the farm that he hadn't fully processed what it would mean to have a child. But every time he saw Madison's hand resting on her belly or felt the flutter of a tiny kick beneath his palm, he was reminded of the new life they were bringing into the world. Jack tries to seem to be preparing for the arrival of his grandchild in his own way. He had started bringing small gifts each time he visited: a knitted blanket, a tiny pair of boots, even a set of children's books. It was clear that he was trying to find his place in this new chapter, and Aiden appreciated the effort. One evening after a long day of work, Aiden and Jack found themselves sitting on the porch watching the sunset. The sky was painted with shades of pink and orange and the air was cool. And still, it reminded Aiden of the first few weeks he had spent on the farm, when everything had felt new and uncertain. I never told you this, Jack said, breaking the silence. But when I was your age, I wanted to be a writer. Aiden turned to his father, surprised. A writer? Jack nodded, a faint smile on his lips. I had all these big dreams about traveling the world, writing stories, seeing new places. But then my father died and I had to take over the business. I don't regret it. I built something I'm proud of, but I think maybe I lost a part of myself along the way. Aiden listened, sensing the vulnerability in Jack's voice. I didn't know that, he said softly. There's a lot you don't know about me, Jack replied, his smile turning wistful. But I see a lot of that same spirit in you. The desire to build something real, to live a life that matters. And I'm glad you're doing it. Even if it's not the life I imagined for you. Aiden felt a wave of emotion, but he managed to keep his voice steady. Thanks, Dad, he said. I'm glad you're here to see it. As the sun dipped below the horizon, leaving a trail of stars in its wake, Aiden realized that this was what he had been searching for all along. Not just a successful farm, but a sense of connection, of understanding, of family. It hadn't been an easy journey, but it was one that had brought him closer to Madison, to the community, and even to his father. The months passed, and soon it was time for Madison to give birth. The labor was long and exhausting, but when Aiden finally held his newborn daughter in his arms, all the fear and uncertainty melted away. She was tiny, with a shock of dark hair and the most perfect little hands he had ever seen. He couldn't stop staring at her. Overwhelmed by a love that was deeper than anything he had ever known, they named her Grace, a tribute to the sense of peace and hope that had guided them through so much. When Jack came to visit the hospital, he was hesitant at first, unsure of how to approach this new role. But when Aiden handed him Grace, the uncertainty vanished and he cradled her gently, his eyes misty with tears. "She's beautiful," Jack said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You've done well, Aiden." Aiden smiled, watching his father hold his daughter. "We all have," he said. "And it's just the beginning." As they stood there 3 generations together, Aiden felt a sense of completeness. He hadn't realized he was missing the farm, the family, the life they had built. It was everything he had hoped for and more. And as the days stretched ahead, full of promise and possibility, he knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, united by love, by hope, and by a legacy that was finally truly their own.